Here is a thing almost everyone believes about the American presidency, and it is only half true. You cannot serve more than 2 terms. Ask people why, and most will tell you it has always been that way, that the Constitution set it up from the start, the way it set up 2 senators per state, or a 4-year term. It did not. For roughly 150 years, the 2-term limit on the presidency was not a rule at all. It was a habit, a tradition, a very strong, very old, very respected tradition. And then one president simply declined to be bound by it, won a 3rd term and a 4th, and the country decided the habit finally needed to become law. So the question for this primer is exactly that. For a century and a half, the 2-term presidency was a tradition, not a rule. The 22nd Amendment made it binding. What does it actually mean to take a norm, an unwritten custom that had held for generations, and freeze it into constitutional text? This is Do It for the Case Law. Doctrine Deep Dives, Season 0, the amendments, one at a time, one sharpest gap each. Today, the 22nd. Start with what the amendment does, because it is shorter and stranger than people remember. The core is one sentence: no person shall be elected to the office of president more than twice. That is the headline. 2 elected terms, and that is the ceiling. But the drafters were not satisfied with just the headline, because they could see the obvious complication coming. What about a vice president who is not elected to the top job at all but inherits it? A president dies or resigns, and the vice president succeeds partway through someone else's term. Does that partial term count against the 2? So the amendment adds a second, more technical rule. If a person has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which someone else was elected, that person can then be elected only once. More than 2 years of an inherited term, and you get 1 election of your own, not 2. Do the arithmetic and you find the real ceiling. Imagine a vice president who becomes president with, say, 1 year left in the term they inherited. 1 year is less than 2, so that partial term does not use up an election. They can still be elected twice in their own right and could, in theory, serve close to 9 years. But push that inherited stretch past the 2-year mark. Imagine someone who takes over with 3 years remaining, and now they may be elected only once more, capping them well short. Add it all up, in 10 years is the practical maximum the amendment allows any one person in the office, the tail end of an inherited term, plus 2 full elected terms of their own. It is a limit on elections, expressed with a careful little piece of math about time served. It is worth being precise about one thing that trips people up. The amendment limits elections, not years, and those are different rulers. A president who serves 2 full elected terms serves 8 years and is done. But a vice president who inherits, say, 23 months of someone else's term has not been elected at all during that stretch, so nothing has been spent. They may still be elected twice, 2 months more, and the arithmetic flips, and they may be elected only once. So 2 people could serve the identical amount of time and face completely different ceilings, depending on how that time was acquired. That is not sloppiness. It follows from the choice to regulate the ballot rather than the calendar, but it does mean the practical limit on any given person depends on an accident of when a predecessor left office. There is also a small, revealing exception written right into the text. The amendment expressly does not apply to whoever was president at the moment Congress proposed it, and that was Harry Truman, whom the drafters quietly grandfathered out. So the rule that was born to stop the next Roosevelt did not even bind the man sitting in the chair when it passed. It looked forward, not back. Truman stayed eligible, the bar fell on everyone who came after him. That is worth noticing for what it says about how constitutional change actually gets done. A rule that applied immediately to the sitting president would have been a rule aimed at a person. Exempting him made it a rule aimed at an office. It also, not incidentally, made it easier to pass. Right now, the part everyone skips. Why this exists, and why in 1951 and not before, the answer is one precedent and one man who broke it. George Washington served 2 terms and then walked away. He did not have to. There was no rule stopping him. But he declined a 3rd term. And in doing so, he set a precedent that hardened over generations into something close to sacred. Thomas Jefferson followed it and reinforced it, stepping down after 2 terms of his own, and the tradition held with remarkable strength. Ulysses Grant reached for a 3rd term, and his own party turned him away. Theodore Roosevelt tried to come back for a 3rd term, and the voters turned him away. For about 150 years, the 2-term tradition held on nothing but the weight of Washington's example. No statute, no clause, just a custom nobody was quite willing to break. And the reason the custom carried such weight is worth naming. The generation that wrote the Constitution had just fought a war to be rid of a king, and the deepest fear about this new office of president was that it would slowly curdle back into one. A single executive who never leaves, entrenching himself election after election until the idea of him leaving becomes unthinkable. Washington's 2-term exit was the living answer to that fear. Every president who honored it afterward was, in effect, reperforming the same promise, that this office is temporary, that power here is lent and not kept. That is the norm the 22nd Amendment would eventually write down. Then came Franklin Roosevelt. Elected in 1932 in the depths of the Depression, re-elected in 1936, and then with a World War gathering he ran again in 1940 and won a third term. And in 1944 he ran a fourth time, and won again. He died in office in 1945 early in that fourth term. Whatever you think of Roosevelt, the tradition was simply gone. The habit had been broken, decisively 4 elections over, and the reaction was to convert the broken norm into a written rule. Congress proposed the amendment in 1947 and it was ratified in 1951. The 22nd Amendment takes Washington's voluntary restraint and makes it mandatory, so that no future president can do what Roosevelt did. It is worth pausing on the timing, because it tells you something about what kind of law this is. The amendment was proposed by a Congress newly controlled by the party that had just lost 4 straight presidential elections to the man in question. That is not a scandal, and it does not make the amendment illegitimate, but it does mean the vote was not taken in a vacuum of pure constitutional principle. And yet it was ratified by 3/4 of the states, across 4 years, under both parties. Whatever the motive at the proposal stage, the country as a whole agreed to it. Constitutional amendments are hard on purpose, and that difficulty is a filter, a measure that clears it has support well past whoever first wanted it. Now the interesting part, because the 22nd is unusual for this show. Most of the problems we chase open up because the text is vague and the courts have to fill it in over decades. This amendment is the opposite. It is one of the most precise mechanical provisions in the whole Constitution, and it has produced almost no litigation. There is no landmark Supreme Court case interpreting the 2-term limit, because there has been almost nothing to fight about. The rule is arithmetic. You either have been elected twice or you have not. We checked that rather than assuming it, because on this show an absence of case law is a claim like any other and has to be verified. It holds. But precision is not the same as completeness, and the amendment left a couple of genuine seams. The first is the succession math we just walked through. Clean in the ordinary case, but scholars still poke at its edges. The second is more interesting, because the text does not squarely answer it. The amendment bars a person from being elected president more than twice. It says nothing in its own words about other routes back into the office. Could a twice-elected former president be placed on a ticket as vice president and then succeed to the presidency again without ever being elected to it? The usual answer is no. The 12th Amendment says that no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president, and that is generally read to close the door. But notice where the closing comes from: a different amendment, stitched to this one by interpretation. The 22nd, by its own terms, limits elections, not every conceivable path to power. That is a drafting seam, not an enforcement failure. And the seam is narrower than it first looks, because the argument turns on a word. Is a twice-elected former president constitutionally ineligible to the office, or merely ineligible to be elected to it again? Those are not the same thing, and the 12th Amendment's bar is written in terms of the first. Someone who thinks the distinction matters has a textual argument to make. No court has ever had to resolve it, because no one has ever tried. Here is where I want to bring in a contrast case, because it sharpens what the 22nd Amendment actually is. This one is not about the presidency at all, it is about Congress. Ask the natural next question. If we can limit the president to 2 terms, why can we not limit members of Congress the same way? People have tried. In the 1990s, a wave of states passed measures to impose term limits on their own senators and representatives. Arkansas was one of them, and its measure reached the Supreme Court in 1995 in a case called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton. And the court said the states could not do it. Before the contrast case, one more feature of the text that rarely gets attention. The amendment does not say a former president may never hold the office again. It says no person shall be elected to it more than twice. Read literally, those are different prohibitions, and the difference is the seam we just walked. A rule about elections leaves open, at least textually, any route to the office that is not an election. The 12th Amendment is doing the work of closing that, and it is doing it by implication rather than by saying so directly. Whether that matters is genuinely unsettled, and it is unsettled in the quietest possible way, not because courts disagree, but because the question has never been put to one. It is another of those constitutional questions that is open in the sense of untouched, rather than contested. Here is the holding, verbatim, quote, "The power to add qualifications is not part of the original powers of sovereignty that the 10th Amendment reserved to the states," end quote. The states, in other words, have no reserved power to bolt a term limit, a new qualification, onto the ones the Constitution already sets for Congress. And the court went further, saying the framers intended the Constitution to be, quote, the exclusive source of qualifications for members of Congress, end quote, and had thereby divested the states of any power to add qualifications. And there is a historical grace note buried in that same opinion that speaks directly to our amendment. The court observed that at the founding, quote, the question whether to require term limits or rotation was a major source of controversy, end quote, and that the draft submitted for ratification contained no such provision. Term limits were on the table in 1787, argued over hard and deliberately left out, which is exactly the point. If you want them, you do not get them by wishing a tradition into binding law, you get them by amendment. Sit with why that matters here. It means a term limit is not something a legislature can simply impose on a federal office by ordinary law. If you want to cap how many times someone can hold a national office, you generally have to do it the hard way, by amending the Constitution itself. And that is precisely what the 22nd Amendment is. Not a statute, not a state law, not a tradition, but a constitutional amendment, proposed by Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states, hard-coding a term limit into the founding document. Thornton decided decades later and about Congress is the negative image that shows you what the 22nd had to be. You cannot legislate a federal term limit into existence. You can only amend one in. The presidency got its amendment. Congress never did, which is why to this day there is no limit at all on how many terms a senator or representative can serve. And that asymmetry is itself worth a moment. The office the founders worried most about becoming a monarchy is the one with a hard cap. The branch they expected to be closest to the people and most easily replaced by them has none. Whether that is wisdom or accident depends on who you ask, but it is not a design anyone sat down and chose as a whole. It is two separate answers given a century and a half apart to a question nobody asked twice. One more thing before the close, because it is the most debated practical effect. The moment a president wins that second term, the 22nd Amendment turns them into what critics call an instant lame duck. They can never face the voters again, and everyone in Washington knows it. Which, the argument goes, quietly drains a second-term president's leverage over Congress, over their own party, over the whole machinery of government, because there is no longer any re-election to reward loyalty or punish defection. Defenders say that drain is the entire point, forced rotation, guaranteed renewal, a hard stop on the accumulation of power in one pair of hands. Whether the amendment weakens second-term presidents or simply disciplines them is a genuine and unresolved debate. But notice what kind of debate it is. It is about consequences, not about meaning. Everyone agrees on what the rule says. So here is the thesis, and for this amendment it is not a loophole or a doctrinal trick. It is conceptual. The 22nd Amendment is a case study in what a country gains and what it gives up when it takes an unwritten norm and hard codes it into text. Look first at what it guarantees. Rotation. Certainty. No future Roosevelt, no matter how popular, no matter the crisis, gets a third term. The habit that once depended on each president's personal willingness to honor it now depends on nothing at all. It is simply the law, and it runs whether or not anyone feels like honoring it. That is real, and it is the whole appeal of writing a norm down. You stop trusting restraint and start trusting text. A norm can erode. A single ambitious figure, in a frightening enough moment, can talk a country into making one exception, and then another, until the exception quietly becomes the rule. Text does not erode that way. It just says no, to everyone, in every circumstance, forever. And that flat, unbending refusal is precisely the security the amendment was built to give. It is also worth saying that this is the rare constitutional rule that has never once been tested by a serious attempt to break it. Whether that is because the text is clear, or because the norm underneath it was always the real constraint, is a question the amendment cannot answer about itself. There is a further wrinkle worth naming, because it cuts against the tidy story. The 22nd Amendment binds the person. It does not bind the office, and it does not bind the party, and it certainly does not bind whatever influence a former president retains after leaving. A president who has served twice can still lead a movement, still pick a successor, still hold effective power without holding the office. The amendment forecloses one specific thing: their name on the ballot for that job, a third time. It does not foreclose the concentration of political power in one figure, which is the thing the founders were actually afraid of. So the amendment is narrower than its reputation. It guarantees rotation in the office. It does not guarantee rotation in power, and those two things can come apart. But look at what it costs. Before 1951, the two-term limit was a custom, and a custom is flexible. In an extraordinary moment, the electorate kept the option to re-choose, to say, this once, in this emergency, we want the same leader again, and to be answerable for that choice at the next ballot box. The country exercised exactly that option with Roosevelt 4 times over. through a depression and a world war. The 22nd Amendment takes that option off the table. It does not merely discourage a third term, it forecloses one permanently, for everyone in every circumstance, popular or hated, wartime or peace. The flexible custom becomes a fixed bar. That is the trade, and here is the sharpest way to put it. Codifying a norm converts judgment into rule. The old two-term tradition asks something of each generation, the restraint to stop, and the wisdom to recognize a moment extraordinary enough to justify not stopping. The 22nd Amendment answers both of those questions in advance, once, for all time, and lifts them out of the electorate's hands entirely. You gain a guarantee you can count on absolutely. You lose the ability to ever decide otherwise. That is what it means to freeze a convention into constitutional text. The norm gets stronger, and the people who live under it get one fewer choice. It is also worth being honest that we do not actually know whether the amendment is what is holding the line. Since 1951, no president has attempted a third term, and the amendment is the obvious explanation. But the norm it codified had already held for 150 years without any text at all, and it was broken exactly once by a figure of unusual stature in a moment of genuine emergency. So the honest position is that we have one data point, in one direction, and no way to run the counterfactual. Perhaps the text is doing the work. Perhaps the custom would have reasserted itself after Roosevelt regardless. Constitutional provisions that are never tested are the hardest kind to evaluate, because their success and their irrelevance look exactly the same from the outside. And that tension has never really gone away. Almost from the moment it was ratified, the 22nd Amendment has drawn proposals to repeal it. The argument being that in a democracy, if the people genuinely want to keep a leader, the Constitution itself should not be the thing standing in their way. The counter-argument is the founders' own, that the entire danger is a leader too popular to dislodge, and that the point of a term limit is to bind exactly the moment when a country might not want to let go. Both sides are really arguing about the same trade the amendment struck, certainty against choice, just from opposite ends of it. That the argument is still live, decades later, is the clearest sign that hard-coding the norm did not settle the underlying question. It just picked an answer. And there is one more asymmetry hiding in the trade, which is about who bears it. The restraint the old norm asked for fell on the president. It was their decision to walk away, and their reputation on the line if they did not. The bar the amendment imposes falls on the electorate. The president in question does not choose anything, the voters simply lose an option they used to have. That is a real shift in where the discipline sits. The norm disciplined the powerful person. The rule disciplines everyone else, in order to constrain the powerful person. Both get you rotation. They do not distribute the cost of it the same way, and a country that finds itself wanting a third term will feel that difference sharply. That is the sample. A full Amendment 22 season on this show would take the whole story in turn, the Washington precedent and why it held for a century and a half, the Roosevelt terms that broke it, the succession and election math and all its edge cases. The 12th Amendment seam and whether ineligible to the office means the same as ineligible to be elected. The instant lame duck debate, and the recurring proposals either to repeal the amendment or to extend its logic to Congress. One question per episode, each anchored in the historical record and, where the law reaches it, in cases we verify rather than remember. A word on how this show works. Everything you just heard is legal and constitutional education, not legal advice. We are teaching how a provision came to be and how it works, not telling you how to vote or what to do. And where we quoted a case, we quoted a real one. U.S. term limits versus Thornton is a genuine decision of the Supreme Court, and the line we read about the power to add qualifications was pulled from the court's own opinion before I wrote a single word around it. The history is the record, the one holding is verified, nothing here is remembered, and merely hoped to be right. That is the whole ethos, and it is the name of the show. Do it for the case law. I'll see you at the next amendment.